Hey, Millennial leaders. Man, I'm so thankful that for all of you that have been listening. A couple of days ago, we actually surpassed a little over 100 downloads. For those of you that have been downloading on iTunes and other podcast apps, thank you for following along. I hope that this has been a good experience for you. I know I've been learning a lot, and I'm thankful that you've been along for this journey. Something that I'm passionate about, I know many of you are passionate about, and that's leadership in the millennial generation. I was so excited to speak with a friend of mine, Theon. He's 28 years old, and he's got a PhD in communications. He's a bright guy who speaks very clearly and very articulately. He shares what happens when passion runs out. He touches on mentoring. And what I love about what he has to say about mentoring is he does more than just talk about it. He will get on a plane to go visit those that he wants to pursue. We, of course, talk about embracing failure, making a way, and pursuit of what you believe to be right and how to stick through in that. I'm happy to bring this podcast to you. I hope that this gives you lots of value. If this does give you lots of value, I would love your support by feedback on iTunes or visiting the website millennialleader.org. All right. Well, with that said, let's jump in.
Welcome to the Millennial Leader Podcast with Carlos Reyes, encouraging and equipping a generation to lead.
All right, welcome to millennialleader.org. I'm your host, Carlos Reyes. I'm excited to have a friend of mine, Theon Hill, is 28 years old, a millennial who is teaching. He has his PhD in communications. Theon, I'm really thankful you're on the show with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Carlos. It's a joy to be here.
Absolutely. You know, we met through a friend a couple of weeks ago, I believe now, and I think we just really clicked and hit it off.
Yes, we did. It was a great conversation.
Theon, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing today.
Okay, so I hail from Chicago, Illinois. I was born and raised in the suburbs of Chicago. My parents homeschooled me growing up because in the area where I lived, my mom had been a public school teacher and she was really dissatisfied with how she felt that minorities were being treated in the schools. And so she made the decision to retire from teaching, and she homeschooled my brother and I. And she raised us in the Lord. Both of my parents were Christians early on. And I went on to school and eventually completed my PhD in communication. And I'm a professor now at Westchester University.
Why did you pursue so much education?
My decision to pursue education was really made in high school. And I always knew that I wanted to get a PhD because as a Christian, I wanted to know how can I have the maximum impact for Christ in the world. And my decision to study communication was I went to church, I went to various camps, and I was in various contexts, and I felt that the word of God was not being proclaimed powerfully. People were not preaching with power, and I read a Bible that says, you know, the word of God is swift and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword. I realized that we understand the world through words. And I was like, I have to learn how I can communicate more effectively so that I can give the truth of God to a lost and dying world.
Tell me a little bit, you are teaching today.
Yes.
Tell me, what are you teaching?
My research and my teaching interests really intersect at the study of the role of radical rhetoric as a form of civic engagement and public advocacy. So what I study is, what is the role of a Martin Luther King Jr. in society? What is the role of a Frederick Douglass? If we want to go really old school, what's the role of a Martin Luther? We celebrate these people today, but in their times, they were rejected by society. You know, we have holidays to celebrate their sacrifices, but these men and women throughout history have taken radical stances in defense of what they believed were sacred truths. I study and teach classes in those areas because I want to know as an individual, what does it mean for me to be radical in defense of what I believe to be right, and how can I prepare the next generation of young people to take radical stances in society?
And I know this just because we sat and we talked for a long time, but I believe college gave you a whole new perspective on the reality of the scope of what these men and women accomplished in their time. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it shaped you?
Definitely. So When I got in high school, I'm leading into the college, I'll just set up the framework. When I got into high school, my mother made me give her my plan on how I was going to get out of her house within 4 years. And so I had to give her my college plan. At the time, and still long term, I want to be in Christian ministry because I think that's where I can make my greatest impact. I knew that Bob Jones University had a great biblical studies program. I also knew that it was a highly controversial place when it came to race relations. And as an African-American, that made me somewhat nervous, and it made my parents very nervous. The reason why I decided to go to Bob Jones, first of all, was I thought the biblical studies program would be good for me to get that perspective, but also knowing the racial history of the university and how it was poor at times, I thought it would be a great opportunity for me to be in an environment in which I was uncomfortable, in which everyone did not look like me, in which the diversity that I was used to from the Chicago area would not be present. So I went to Bob Jones, and I had a number of experiences. I found that, is there going to be racism at a place like Bob Jones? There's racism anywhere in life, but I didn't find that the majority of people were not racist. What I did find was that many of my peers, many of my colleagues had not been around an African American, so they didn't necessarily know how to act around me. So there was a great culture gap, so we had to find common ground. We had to work through any number of misunderstandings and difficult experiences, even hurtful names being put out at times. But through that experience, what I learned was, how do I maintain love for someone who I don't understand? How do I maintain love for someone who might say something that hurts me to the core? How do I maintain love for people who may come across as unlovely? And how do I maintain love in an environment in which I feel thoroughly uncomfortable? So as I look at my life today and this embrace of radical rhetoric and what it means to embrace a belief even when you're different, I go back and I thank my folks at Bob Jones University for what I learned there and how it forced me to be comfortable in a situation in which I might be different than everyone else. Because without that, I don't know that God would have given me the opportunities to take some of the courageous stands that I've tried to take throughout my life since college.
Absolutely. Sometimes our words are kind of cheap, but I get the sense that you have experienced, a lot of the things that you're saying, and it's not just words to you, but there are memories and moments attached to that.
Yes, there are. I mean, as I think back on my time in college, as I think back to those days, there's many experiences where someone might use a name that should not be used. Someone might make a comment that's somewhat insensitive. Someone might take a perspective that you're not used to, and you're forced to deal with that. I can remember one situation where something was said from the chapel platform, and it was racially insensitive. And so I had to go to the person who spoke on the chapel platform and say, what you said was wrong. It was racially insensitive, and you're alienating us. And I was like, at the end of the day, the reason why this burdens me so much, it's not just because that racial insensitive is bad. But when you are racially insensitive like this, it communicates to us that we're not your brothers and sisters in Christ, that race is bigger than Christ. And so we have to find a way to work through these differences. We have to find a way to work through these barriers and elevate Christ to a supreme position in which he is our all in all, and his power has the potential to break through the barriers of race and ethnicity which have traditionally divided us.
Wow, I can't even imagine many of the things that you went through. And it's actually very courageous that you took that step. I don't know at that time if I could have taken that step, but clearly your past has played an enormous role in who you are today. Could you share a little bit more about how your past, and specifically with the leadership, has shaped you?
The way that the past experiences have shaped who I am today, I start with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who remains a source of inspiration to me at all times. I have a picture of him on my desk right next to me now. He said a statement in one of his speeches during the Civil Rights Movement, "It's only when it's dark enough that we can see the stars." And that reflects that he had an understanding of the world around him. He was dissatisfied with what he saw. He looked around. He saw racism. He saw poverty. He saw injustice. So he saw the situation, and it was really bleak. But not just did he see the situation, but he said, I am in a position to change this situation. So when we talk about a millennial leader, as I understand it, a millennial leader is an individual who has a strong conception of the reality in which he or she lives. But paired with that conception of that reality, he or she has a strong conception of his or her role in making a change in that society. So for me, that goes back to several things. First of all, a moral grounding. As a Christian, my moral grounding is the Word of God. That's what I stand for. That's what I believe in. That's my moral center. Paired with that moral grounding, a strong understanding of history. One of the great weaknesses of millennial leaders as I interact with my students, they don't know the past. They don't know what's happened in the past. They don't know what has happened historically, how we've gotten to where we are today. So you have to have that moral grounding, but you also have an understanding of how have we gotten to this point that we are today. And then you have the strong understanding of what can I do as an individual to change the situation. So some things that I'm really passionate about in my teaching and in my ministry. I'm really passionate about mentoring youth. I'm really passionate about mentoring people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, who have been in trouble with the law. And it's not that that's the only need in society, but that's a need that as I look at the skill set that I have, as I look at the abilities that God has blessed me with, that's an area that I can make a difference. So I have an understanding, where can I make a change in today's society? An example of this is after high school, even before I went to Bob Jones, I became really burdened for juvenile delinquents. So I spent a full year, I took a year off school, and I worked with juvenile delinquents full time in the state of Indiana in a Christian counseling center. That was one of the best years of my entire life because at that time I understood what does it mean to lead. And when I was working with young people, I learned that it meant to pour my life into theirs, to give of myself, to sacrifice, to constantly prepare myself so that I'm ready to give more and more. I remember one young man that I was working with. This young man stressed me out all the time. I mean, I got punched. I got beaten up by him a couple times when when folks got loose,
right.
When we were trying to hold them down and restrain them from doing different things. But I'll tell you this, working with that young man and pouring my life into him was one of the greatest opportunities of my life. Because through those struggles, through those difficult times, through, interacting, I learned what does it mean to devote yourself to a cause higher than yourself. And that was the blessing of working with young people. And that continues to be a passion of mine. Here at Westchester, I'm frequently meeting with students out of class to try to mentor them. I met with 2 young men earlier this week. I met with a couple of students this evening, and we were just talking about what leadership opportunities do we have, where we are, and how can we advance certain agendas? How can we make society better?
How do you go about narrowing and targeting, what it is that we are, is it what we're passionate about that helps people to decide, hey, listen, I want to pour and invest my life in X?
Yes, excellent question. As I look at what we pour our lives in, I think it starts with what we're passionate about. But let me just give you an example. I might be really great or really passionate about troubled youth, for instance, but I might be horrible with people. I might have horrible interpersonal skills. So the idea of interacting with a juvenile delinquent every day might not be the best use of my time. That doesn't mean that I need to leave that field alone. It might mean that I need to look at my skill set and say, what can I do to address this issue? For me, I have gifts as a communicator. That's been my training. That's been my background. So I love interacting with individuals. I love the conversations. I love the dialogue. I love investing in people's lives. For others, the best thing that they could do if they were going to attack the issue of juvenile delinquents, they might be great at fundraising. They might be great at managing the finances of an organization. They might be great at administration. We're all in the same struggle, but what are you gifted with? And how can you address the passions that you have, the burdens that you have with that skill set? I frequently tell my students, don't limit your vision to what exists in terms of a career opportunity or a ministry opportunity. Make a way. Find something. If what you're looking for does not exist, develop it yourself. And I think that's part of what you're doing, Carlos, with the Millennial Leader Initiative.
I love what you did, not that last part, but making a way. There is something about leaders that are passionate and driven that when they are problem solvers, they see, some people see, right, all the barriers, all the walls as they get higher and higher and encroach around them. And then there's people who identify the crack in the wall, they solve the problem, they build the ladder, whatever it is, and they make a way. Have you always thought that way your entire life, or is that something that you've developed in the last decade or so?
The roots of it were definitely planted within me, so to speak, by my parents at a young age. Growing up as a minority, my parents always raised me with the idea that you have to be twice as good as the next person. You have to be willing to work through barriers. My father was a student of the civil rights movement, and he actually saw Dr. King speak as a young child. So I was constantly surrounded with people who had broken through barriers. But I think that I probably grew into viewing life that way as I got older, as you start running into barriers. And to be honest with you, I probably learned my greatest lesson from that when I was working with juvenile delinquents. I had been working at this counseling center for 2.5 months, and it was at the end of an August. I think the August was 2003, August of 2003. And I got to a point, Carlos, that I was just exhausted. I was emotionally drained. I was tired. I didn't feel like I was making any kind of an impact with the young people I was working at, and I was completely discouraged. My mother came to visit me, and when she came, I'm not a person to cry. Those who know me know I don't cry at all, but I broke down just because I was at the end of myself. I didn't know that I had anything left to offer. And that, for me, was my moment of testing. At that moment, my mom asked me, she's like, Theon, do you want to come home? Do you just want to go straight to college? And everything in me was screaming out, yes, please go. Go right now. Give up.
Right.
Don't do this. But as I looked at that opportunity to work with young people, and I thought about the burden that I had, I didn't know if I would have any success. I didn't know if anything good would come of it, but I knew I couldn't give up. I knew I couldn't just give in just because it was getting hard. And at that moment, I told my mother, I want to give up. I want to come home. I want to just go straight to college. But something is holding me here. This burden is just driving me, and I can't give in. I have to keep going on. That, for me, was the turning point of my life. We've talked a little bit about various issues that I had when I was at Bob Jones, or various challenges that I was confronted with. It's interesting, when I was going through those challenges, or when I was confronted with maybe some racial prejudice in different situations, I never really thought about giving up anymore, because I went through that test with working with juvenile delinquents. I had been through that. I was like, I'm gonna be committed to this. I don't care if I die in something, in pursuing what I believe to be right. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep on going. So that was something that I grew into once I was faced with failure. It's like, you might fail, but I'm going to get back up. I might not succeed, but it's not going to hold me down. I will keep coming.
I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into that, because I think that's what separates many people, is this idea of there is something driving in our lives that we cannot get. I mean, it looks impossible, or it's challenging, or I feel broken in the situation. Can you kind of give just a little bit of background? What continued to drive you so hard? Was it simply passion, or was there something else driving you?
It was in part passion, but when you're discouraged, sometimes your passions are diminished. I think what drove me was the need that I saw. So I'm looking at these young people, and it hit me, if I leave, not that I'm indispensable, but not many people were lining up to work with juvenile delinquents. Not many people were lining up to work with young people. If I leave, who's going to be here to work with them? Who's going to step up to the plate? So you get to this point, you see, the need is so great. It's kind of like the parable of the Good Samaritan. So often we ask the question when we're confronted with needs, if I stop to help this person, what's going to happen to me? And as soon as we start asking that question, we set ourselves up for failure. If our primary concern is our comfort, our needs, our desires, our wants, we're going to give up as soon as those are violated. But I love, once again, I always come back to King. I love what he said when he talked about the Good Samaritan story. The question is not, if I stop to help this person, what's going to happen to me? The fundamental question that we have to ask, and this is where our generation must ask this question, if I do not stop to help this person, what's going to happen to him or her? We take our eyes off of ourselves and we put them on someone else. When my mom asked me, did I want to come home? Everything within me wanted to say yes. But that idea that if I leave, who's going to be here kept me there. I didn't know if I could make a difference. I didn't know if I could produce a change. But I knew one thing. If I left, I had already decided the fate of any potential I had with those young people. So after I chose to stay, the next day was not great. The day after it was even worse. I had many more days of tears before things got better. But Carlos, I had a situation about 3 months after that turning point where a young person just pulled me aside and he's like, Theon, I just want to thank you for the ways that you've invested in my life. He's like, you've been the closest thing to a father that I've had.
Wow.
And this young man, he had punched me in the face. He had called me a nigger. He had told me all kinds of mean things. But that moment made everything worth it. Even after I finished that internship, for the next couple of years, he called me every Father's Day just to say hello. I'm not going to tell you that his life is perfect now or that he's completely changed. But I'll tell you this. He knows that there's someone out there who loves him. He knows that there's someone out there who has his back. He knows there's someone out there who sees him and who's always ready to help if he can. And for everything rough in that situation, it made it worth it. But I wouldn't have had that experience if I hadn't taken my eyes off of myself.
Yeah, very powerful. Just pragmatically, I mentioned, some of the hows and the whys. What are some things that when things get tough, perhaps there's a goal or something we're pursuing, things get tough, what can people do pragmatically to stay focused, to push through? Is there maybe a mental trick? Is it some type of accountability? What can we do to stay focused on whatever X is?
Yes. For me, when I got into those really difficult spots, whether it was working with juvenile delinquents, whether it was at Bob Jones University, whether it was completing my PhD at Purdue University, the one thing that I learned was, first of all, I had to consistently meditate on Scripture, and I had to stay constant in prayer. So one Bible verse that became very dear to me was Psalm 61:2, where David said, from the end of the earth I will cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. And the idea that my Savior was my foundation in the midst of the storm carried me through those moments. Another thing, not just having that constant prayer window with the Lord, but it's important to have friends that you can just vent with. I had 2 or 3 good guy friends that I could just come to and say, hey, just talk with me, hear me out. What can I, just talk to me, listen to me, tell me I'm crazy. But those friendships become very important because you'll typically only have a couple of really good friends you can go to like that. I felt very fortunate to have 2. And then third, find something that you can do to relax. Something that you can do just to take the stress off, to take the edge off of that bad day or that really difficult moment. For me, it's always been playing basketball. Those moments when I really got frustrated when I was writing my dissertation, wondering if it would ever get finished, I would just grab my basketball and go to the court, and it felt like that was my space to just think through things. That was my area. For some, it may be playing the piano. For others, it may be art. Whatever it is for you, find something that's just going to take your mind off it and allow you to relax. But those 3 things became very important to me in working through difficult times.
I like how you said basketball. Next time you're down, we'll have to play.
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. Let's do it.
So I'm with a group that plays basically every Wednesday night, and the first night, it had been a while since I had played. It was 3-4 weeks ago, and it was bad. I mean, I could barely dribble, and then as time has passed, I getting my shot back and was able to drive the lane actually this past Wednesday, so it was fun. But I think you're so right. For me, certainly is prayer and being in my Bible. You have to absolutely have people that you can communicate with and you can speak to and you can just vent.
Yes.
That you just kind of get it out. And I always ask people, too, that are in positions of leadership or high pressure, being here in Washington, D.C., there are tons of them. Yes. But hey, what do you do to deal with that stress? And it's really interesting. You can see the people that do nothing.
Yes, you can.
You can tell.
They are so unsettled, and they're always in, like, there's no peace. The internal peace is just gone from their lives, and, like, they're always on edge.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that when you think about, you don't really recognize until you begin to think about it, and you start to notice, hey, how do I handle it, and begin to notice it. Absolutely. Thank you for those three, because I kind of sprung those on you.
Yes. Well, I think it's important to think through how we're going to handle these situations, and as much as I have them in my mind right now to be able to explain them that succinctly, within a crisis situation, it's not always 100% that I'm going to remember to do those, and I think you always come back to this point, okay, what am I not doing here? What have I forgotten to do? Okay, I just need to put this in context, put this in perspective, and get back to getting in Scripture, as you said, going to those friends and talking with them, and just finding that place where I can relax.
You know, we spoke, and I remember this somewhat from our conversation, but I'd love to hear, this is something that comes up all the time in our conversation, the concept of mentoring or coaching type relationships. I feel like, I don't know about you, but mentoring seems more intimate than coaching. At the same time, we don't want a top-down type of mentorship relationship, but we want somebody that we can trust and believe in, that we feel is like feeding us. Can you talk about your experience with mentors?
Yes. In terms of mentors, the best piece of advice that I ever received in seeking mentors for myself was find the people who you admire and the people who are too busy to mentor you and ask them to do so. And so what I did in college, I've done this as recently as last week, I found people who, for a particular skill set, I was like, I need what they have. So in undergrad, at Bob Jones University, my dean was an individual who I came to. It's like, you have a skill set that I don't have. It's not that I agree with you or we share everything in common, but in this particular area, I need godly mentors. So would you mind spending once a month with me, once every couple months, and can I just ask you questions? Can I just talk with you about different things? Can I raise issues with you and pick your brain? Not for the purpose of always agreeing with you, always doing exactly what you say, but for the purpose of sharpening my own ability to think critically about pressing issues. And through those experiences, through the ability to just ask people, as you and I had talked about previously, we'll just ask whoever, because we know that we can learn something from them. And I take this philosophy when I seek mentors. All they can do is say no. A couple of years ago, I was doing research for my dissertation, and I saw Cornel West on the news, and I was like, I can learn a lot from him. He's someone who I would probably have numerous disagreements with for various reasons, and he and I have talked about some of those reasons. But it was like, from an academic standpoint, he's someone I would want to mentor me. So I knew he's far too busy to mentor me. I stalked him at a speaking engagement. Then I flew out to Princeton, and I begged him, Dr. West, there's an area where I can learn from you. Can you tell me? Can you teach me? Can you spend time with me? He looks at me, Brother Theon, I'm a terribly busy person, but you doing the Lord's work. I'm in. Wow. And at that moment, I developed a relationship, and I still maintain a relationship with him. But when I seek mentors, I target them. I target the people who are beyond my wildest dreams. I would love to interact with this person. I would love to spend time with a Cornel West. I would love to interact with a D.A. Carson. I would love to interact with this figure. And I'll pursue them because I know at any point they have something to offer me. When I think about a mentor, and I think the PhD taught me this more than anything else. The PhD taught me how much I don't know. It taught me how much there still is for me to learn. I feel that coming out of it, those 4 years spent writing that dissertation, I know that there's a whole world out there that I don't know. So more than ever before, I'm aware I need mentors. I need people who are helping sharpen my thoughts so that I can minister more effectively. So it's not necessarily a top-down thing, a top-down model, but it's more of the acknowledgement that people have perspectives, views, beliefs that I don't. And I can learn a lot from exposing myself to that dialogue and to those conversations with others.
Great insight. I was just thinking about this, and I'm hoping you can answer this, but we've talked about mentoring in just about every form, but I just thought about this pragmatically. When you have mentors across the country and not in your backyard, I know you're going to end up moving in a little bit too, so that'll create some distance with the mentors that you currently have. How do you pragmatically keep in touch with them? Is it all email, phone? Perhaps some of them like getting mail, snail mail?
All of the above. Obviously, technology like Skype or Google Plus, they have a lot to do with it, but I'll give you a practical example. Next week, and I'd planned this even before we planned on talking tonight, but there's a person who works at a seminary in Minnesota who's done some research in an area, church history, that I really think I could learn from. I don't know him personally, but my plan is next week I'll email him and I'll just tell him, your knowledge of church history is extensive, it's expansive, it's well thought out. I feel I could learn a lot from you. Sir, I'm 28 years old and I need mentors. Would you be willing to allow me to email you a couple of questions every couple months? Could I possibly meet with you once a year? Whatever your schedule will allow, I will take, because I want to work around your schedule, because I feel there's a lot that I can learn from you. So with someone like that, we'll do it primarily email if he agrees, which I'm hoping he will. We might do some Skype or phone conversations. For others, I'll typically try to make a trip out to where they are once a year. So with a Dr. Cornel West, he's at Union Theological Seminary now in New York. I'll typically try to go out and meet with him once a year, and we'll just have a long conversation. His travel schedule does not allow him to answer email much, so if I want a conversation with him, I need to talk to him in person. So every relationship is different, but the common ground there is that I try to maintain consistent communication, even if it's only once a year.
How many times did you say you've gone out and flown out to meet with people?
Oh, probably if we're talking, probably at least 10 to 20 flights across the country to meet with various people. I'll try to find ways to get it paid for, if possible. But I've flown to, meet with Dr. West. I had some interest in what Mark Dever was doing there at Capitol Hill Baptist Church. So I wrote him a handwritten note and said, hey, I appreciated some of your ministry. Can I get to know you a little better? He invited me out there to D.C., so we had some great conversations at some of his church's programs there. There's others throughout different fields of politics. I'm hoping to come back to D.C. actually this May and meet with Susan Swain from C-SPAN, because I've interacted with her in some capacities, and I feel that there's a lot that I can learn from her as a trailblazer, being the first president of a news organization who's a woman. So there's a lot of people like that I'll definitely travel across country for, because that's worth it to me. If I can learn something from you, I want to take advantage of that.
And how do you connect? So some of these, you're name dropping some really big names. Is it simply a cold email, or do you use social media to connect?
I'll give you a couple of stories. So I hinted at this a little bit, but I'll tell you with Cornel West an example, and then I'll go on to someone like Susan Swain and just tell you a couple different stories.
By the way, the audience may not know who Cornel West is, but I believe he's got degrees from Harvard and Princeton. Share a little bit about his background so we all know.
Yeah, so Cornel West is arguably the most prominent African-American intellectual in the nation. He's got his degrees from Harvard and Princeton, both undergrad, master's, and PhD. He's been a professor at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, University of Paris, and currently he's at the Union Theological Seminary. Most who are familiar with him have seen him on CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News. His most notable book is going to be the New York Times best-selling book, Race Matters. And so he's been a very influential scholar in the areas of philosophy, race, and African-American religion. So some of my research studied the intersection of politics and religion, so he was a natural person for me to seek out. He typically is in high demand around the country. I mean, he's a person that gets above $25,000 per speaking engagement, so high demand in many ways. I went to one of his speaking engagements back in 2010, and I really wanted to meet him. So I waited for an hour after his speaking engagement for him to leave the building. When he came out the building, I took a quick picture with him. I saved the picture, and the following summer, I emailed him a copy of the picture and said, "Hey, we met before. I was wondering if I could talk to you about possibly mentoring me as a part of my PhD work." He invited me out to Princeton. I made sure that I had read most things that he wrote before I went out there, and I had 15 minutes to persuade him to mentor me, and that's when I gave you the story about him saying, I'm a terribly busy person, but I feel that you're doing the Lord's work, so I'm in.
Wow.
And so that was a great opportunity. He flew out to Purdue for my dissertation defense. He gave a public speaking engagement while he was at Purdue that we had 2,500 people come out for, but it was just all about just going out there. I mean, I definitely have the philosophy when it comes to mentors and just life in general that all they can do is tell you no, and I've lost nothing. Another story is like a Susan Swain from C-SPAN. Brian Lamb, the founder of C-SPAN, is a Purdue graduate. So he's been out to Purdue several times. Every time he comes out, that's an opportunity to get to know someone and just to sit and listen to him. So I had the pleasure of interacting with Brian several times. I still see him every now and then. I saw him last November when I was in D.C. doing some work. Through Brian, he took me around to C-SPAN and just introduced me to people. He introduced me to Susan Swain. And Susan and I started interacting. I've been able to collaborate some with C-SPAN from the academic standpoint. And so this May or June, after my upcoming wedding date, she
congratulations.
She'd love to do lunch in D.C., and I know my fiance really wants to meet her, and so that's just a connection and an opportunity to learn from someone that it was a random opportunity, but your eyes are always open, which I think gets us to another issue of a millennial leader. They always have their eyes open for opportunities. Even the opportunity to meet with Brian Lamb, that just came about when Purdue, a former presidential speechwriter and U.S. Ambassador Carolyn Curiel, she came on staff at Purdue as a clinical professor. I really love politics, and so I worked as her personal assistant for a year. And as working for her personal assistant for a year, I got to really see what life was like in the White House because she had been a presidential speechwriter and senior aide. She had also been a New York Times political editor, so I got to see somewhat of the news side. And also, I got to really get in and get to know Brian Lamb because obviously she forged a lot of the connection between Purdue and C-SPAN. So just even seeing her there and wanting to meet her and just getting to know her, that became a real important task and a real beneficial task. She and I still talk. But that's another example where it was a different approach to trying to build that network. When I first met with her, I had to find out what president did she write for, what were some of the speeches that she wrote, so that I was prepared to talk with her intelligently about her background and seek out her mentorship. I would say more than anyone else, she taught me how politics work in D.C.
Wow, and I really can appreciate you doing your research because, I mean, I can imagine you approaching,
Exactly, and that's what many people do, and that's why they don't get these opportunities. Like, you have to be prepared.
Right. Tell me a little bit about the background. You identifying a mentor based on the skills you had mentioned earlier that I would love to learn from you because you clearly excel in this skill area that I would love to adapt as a part of my arsenal. Talk about the research you do. Do you jump on Wikipedia, social media? How do you go about that?
So I'll take Ambassador Curiel as an example. With Ambassador Curiel, when she came to Purdue, I immediately started researching her background. So I jumped on the internet, and so I started reading her editorials for the New York Times when she was a political editor there. I jumped and looked at what speeches had she written, and so she wrote for President Bill Clinton during the 90s. I want to see what speeches did she write for him? What did she say? What do I have to learn from her? My area of communication is political rhetoric, and so as I was studying it, I was like, this is a person that I could learn a lot from a practical, applied standpoint. I loved all my classes, and I had some great professors, but it's something different to get it from the person who was actually in the trenches. She wrote President Clinton's affirmative action speech. She wrote his Memphis address that he gave to where Martin Luther King Jr. had given his I've Been to the Mountaintop speech. So she had written some powerful speeches in President Clinton's background. There's also a desire, anytime anyone has worked closely with a president, whether you agree with everything that president did or not, there's a tremendous amount that you can learn from that person about how this country is run. So I did my research. Then I made an initial contact. And so I just sent her an email. She didn't know me, but I said, my name is Theon Hill. I've read some of your work, and I'm really interested in what you're doing. Is there any way that you would be willing to meet with me for coffee or for lunch sometime just to chat a little bit more about your experience? Because I feel that there's a lot I can learn from you about political speech writing, which is an area I'm still interested in. And so I targeted her as someone I could learn a lot about political speech writing, but also political governance. She had served as an ambassador to Belize at the end of the 90s and beginning of 2000. So we met and we built a relationship. An opportunity emerged where she needed a personal assistant. So as part of my PhD program, I was paid to be her personal assistant. I was able to organize events for people like Susan Swain, Adam Sharp of Twitter, Jonathan Perlman of BuzzFeed, Ezra Klein, the Washington Post, and various people like this to come out to Purdue. I got to interact with Charles Blow of the New York Times and others. I got to meet some of George W. Bush's speechwriters just from these simple opportunities where I got to know her and work with her. And so I got everything I wanted, and she spent a great deal of time mentoring me. We brought student groups out to D.C. for 2-week stints to learn about the intersections of media, politics, and communication. So I targeted her for that particular skill set, which was a very different skill set than I was looking for from a Cornell West. But I think the philosophy that drives it is this understanding that you're going to need a variety of skills in order to accomplish or in order to meet the demands of your passion. So for me, it's working with young people in a variety of contexts. I need a variety of skills in order to do that, and different people can help me build those skills. And so I look at what do I need to accomplish certain things and who can help me gain those skills that are needed.
I think that's great advice. I don't think we're as focused in doing that and laying it out. Okay, here's the skills I want to develop. Those are the people that have them. How do I connect the dots? So that's really why I asked you pragmatically. So I've had some success over social media, over Twitter. You've been on the ground and you've identified and you've gone that route. Let's switch over a little bit here. You know, I love to talk about resources, and it's not always about books and, you know, Tony Robbins tapes and those type of things. But what resources have helped to develop yourself and your skills into who you are today?
I'll start you off with a book. The first book that comes to mind, it's actually a book that it's somewhat hard to find, but you can find it in Amazon's marketplace. It's titled A Call to Excellence by Gary Inrig. He wrote it as his dissertation from Dallas Theological Seminary. I read it when I was in undergrad. One of my mentors recommended it to me. And that book did much to inspire me to the idea that everything that I do in life, I should do with a high standard of excellence. I should do it well. Whether it's answering your questions this evening, whether it's grading my students' work later on tonight, whether it's writing a speech for an event I'll be speaking for in a couple of months in Chicago, everything should be done with a standard of excellence. You should strive for perfection. So that would be one resource right at the top. But I would say, for me, I'm a communication scholar, so I'm always going to be trying to listen to what's being said in the public sphere, what's being said in different areas. What are the leaders saying today? I think we share a passion for leadership. I frequently utilize TED Talks. I frequently try to watch documentaries and see what the people who I want to be like, what are they saying? What are they doing? What are their habits? So that gets into reading biographies, reading stories about people, reading various resources that know this is what the best practices are if you want to have a tremendous impact on society. Books like Good to Great, they have a good influence on what does it mean to be a leader. What does it look like to manage others, to lead others in various directions? And this is going to be a little random, but I think it's something that we don't value enough as people striving to be leaders. Getting in touch with good literature. I'm talking about poetry, Shakespeare, classic works like A Tale of Two Cities. Things like that speak to the human condition. They speak to emotions that we all encounter. There's a reason why, whether you're talking about a George W. Bush, a Robert Kennedy, a Margaret Thatcher, Frederick Douglass, they all had a great appreciation for classical literature. They all had a good appreciation for poetry. They all had appreciation for thoughts well developed, for art, things like that, because that helps develop the mind. It helps us wrestle with problems that we're confronted with in leadership. It broadens our understanding of the world.
I think that's a great example, and I personally love biographies. You know, people want to say, well, how the heck, Winston Churchill, but you only get a snapshot of Churchill in World War II. But how did Churchill become that man? Who was he before? I mean, people don't realize there was a huge hiatus of Churchill, that he was basically the crazy uncle in the corner.
He was. I mean, he had been thrown out of politics by that point. I just finished Paul Johnson's autobiography of Winston Churchill not too long ago.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. Fascinating story. It's actually something, I just read it a couple of weeks ago. It has a lion on it. I don't remember the title off the top of my head, but I'll post that certainly in the show notes. Hey, quickly, if you had one piece of advice to give to future millennial leaders, what would that be?
Embrace failure. I think we, as millennials, tend to give up the first time we fail. But I think of the words of, Samuel Beckett. Samuel Beckett said it best. As millennials, if we want to be powerful leaders, we need to learn to fail again, fail better, fail again. It's very easy for us to think about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It's very easy for us to praise Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. But as a society, we don't like to acknowledge that those men and women had far more failures than they did successes. So life may not have worked out for you, budding millennial leader, to this point. All may not have went well thus far, but don't give up. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, for those who don't know the story, that was the greatest coup ever. No one expected him to be president. It was supposed to be William Seward that year. Martin Luther King Jr. got beat up so many times in his life. Even at the end of his life, he was facing numerous failures. He had just experienced a failed campaign in Chicago, but these people did not give up. They devoted themselves. So the one thing I would say is just embrace failure. Take it in stride, learn from it, and keep on going.
Great advice. It's something that is scary to talk about, but it's a reality, and how we handle failure certainly shapes who we are as men and women, and ultimately, in scope of this podcast, as millennial leaders. So thank you for that, Theon. Hey, how can we reach you, support you?
The best way to reach me via email is thill2020@gmail.com. I'll get that quicker if it's not mixed in with my student emails. I try to be pretty prompt on emails, but via email, via Twitter, Facebook, any of the social media outlets, LinkedIn, I'm always happy to connect and continue the dialogue. But I want to support both budding leaders and anyone who just wants to talk about it, because I think we can learn a lot from one another. So please feel free to reach out and contact, and let's continue the conversation.
Absolutely. And of course, if anybody wants to, they can look at my Twitter feed. We're friends on there. I think we're connected via Facebook, and I think LinkedIn as well. So we're connected. Theon, I really appreciate you taking time to sit with me, chat with me, and we will talk again in the future.
I'm looking forward to it, Carlos, and thank you so much for maintaining this and doing this. I think you're doing us all a great service in exposing us to a variety of voices on leadership, which situates you as one of those millennial leaders that we are looking to.
Thank you, my friend. We'll talk soon.
Yes, indeed. Thanks.
Bye.
Special thanks to Theon Hill for taking about an hour with me on this podcast just to share his wisdom and all that he's learned over the years. I'm thankful for you listeners for listening in. Please, again, share this via social media. Please make sure you visit the website. Make sure to also subscribe for my newsletter and join the Millennial Leader community. And if you do subscribe for free, I'm going to send you the Millennial Leader Toolbox, the 3 traits 99% of millennial leaders have in common. Just to be clear, the 3 traits the 99% of millennials have in common is sent in your confirmation email. There'll be a link there for you to download it. So make sure to keep an eye on that when you do sign up. I want to leave you with one last thought. Theon had mentioned a quote by Samuel Beckett, "Learning to fail, fail again,
and fail better. I know that there are tons of leaders, not just millennials, who will say that it's not that they've necessarily found success, but that they've learned to fail better and better over the years. Just a thought. See you next time.